Perfect.
All right. So long time no broadcast for me. So this ought to be fun.
It's like riding a bike, Jeff.
Yeah, that's what they say.
As they say. Mm-hmm.
Let me see if I can get this straight here. So is it Luke Heidelbrecht?
Heidebrecht without the
Heidebrecht.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
So hiding. Okay, so Heidebrecht. Luke Heidebrecht.
It's a good mashing of some long ancient German Dutch sort of a thing, you know.
There we go. All right. It works for me. I just don't want to butcher your name too badly there in the introduction. So, all right. Let's see if we can get going here. And I'm going to give myself a little countdown here for editing purposes, and we'll take off. So here we go. In 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to The Long View, a podcast that takes a closer look at the games people play. My name is Jeff Gamble. I'm going to be your special guest host for this evening. Joe and TC are on vacation here in the summer months in the United States here. And when Luke reached out and said, hey, would anybody like to do an episode about automobile? I thought, hey, wait a minute. I know Martin Wallace. I know automobile. I could do that. And we could get an episode done while Joe and TC are taking care of other business and having some fun, I hope. And so I thought, hey, let me reach out to Luke and see if he would be amenable to this. So the Luke I'm referring to is Luke Heidebrecht, who is a frequent friend of the show. And Luke, I wanted to say hello and thank you very much for reaching out and asking to talk about the game of automobile.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that tonight. It's a fantastic game that my group here has been enjoying this summer quite a lot after probably a 2-year hiatus of playing it. But as we'll talk about, it's one of those ones that's easy to jump back into. And there's something beautiful about that. Wallace is sort of a bit of a master in terms of that era of the sort of simple-ish rule set and ease of getting back into games. So yeah, automobile, this is going to be fun.
Fantastic. Looking forward to it. And I think it's just really a great reflection of where we are as a hobby right now when you refer to Martin Wallace's rules as simple.
This is true, and I'm sure we'll discuss this a little bit. But yes.
I have been plowing through PAX Emancipation for about 3 sessions, trying to figure out if I'm ever going to be playing that game correctly. And then I look back at Automobile, which I played just the other day with a group of my friends here to try to prepare for this. And because it'd been a while since I had played it, I still own it, but I hadn't played it in a while. And I was like, oh, these rules are kind of quaint,
Yes, indeed.
It's like, oh, look, you're so simple. Look, it's only like 8 pages. It's not like a whole book and then a supplementary book and then, all this other stuff in there. So, it's an interesting thing to see, when I think about the hobby, when I started, I had rule books like El Grande and Carcassonne, and Martin Wallace was like, ooh, that was a big one. And his rule books were not always fantastic to boot. There were often some gray areas. And I remember thinking, wow, this is really complex. And now you kind of look at some of the games that have been coming out and you're like, well, boy, that's really not that complex at all. And really, one of the fascinating things about the game of automobile, and I'm just going to tease this little thing right here, is that you are basically going to be making, 12 decisions in the game, whole thing.
That's
12 decisions.
That's exactly correct.
That's it.
12 actions. Yeah.
12 things. That's it. And you kind of think to yourself, it's like, well, geez, that doesn't sound like a very much opportunity for enjoyment, but we're going to kind of circle back to that and see if we can determine whether or not 12 is enough. I remember the old television show 8 is enough here in the United States. Hopefully you didn't get, you're a lot younger than me, so hopefully you didn't get subjected to that, but we're going to see if 12 is enough. So, well, Luke, with that little introduction there, I do want to kind of get your story with this game and, sort of the way I always used to start the show, which is, what got you interested in the game? What was it that drew your attention? What grabbed you about the game of automobile? Because this thing came out in 2009, I believe.
2009, yeah. And it was Warfrog, I think, was the original publisher. And then Mayfair published it in 2011.
Yes.
Yeah, and I came to the game, when was it? 2015 is in fact the year that I came to this game. It was, I had an Amazon gift card. And
Nice.
You know what? I was just looking, Canadian Amazon, by the way, is not as robust as the American Amazon options.
No, it's not.
And
Okay.
I remember looking at games on there and thinking, I should just get a game. I don't want a book. I don't want to CD or anything right now. And there, honestly, I had narrowed it down to maybe 3 or 4 choices, and I think this, in fact, may have been, besides Age of Steam, the only other Martin Wallace game that I had played up to that point, like when I purchased it. And so on a bit of a whim, threw Automobile in the cart. I think it was $40 on Amazon, and I got it. And I don't even know if I was super eager to play it, but that's sort of how I came to it. I don't know. It wasn't really any real Martin Wallace fanboy kind of a route. I think it was maybe seeing reviews on Board Game Geek, or you know what? I think you maybe had even mentioned it, listening to old Longview episodes in sort of a best of Martin Wallace or something like that. And so it was in my head, right? And I'm not sure where the inception came, but yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of times when you talk to people, they're kind of like me, where it's like, okay, I like Martin Wallace, and so now I'm going to try and grab everything by Martin Wallace that I can possibly find. And you kind of sort of came at it from just hey, I've got a gift card, and I recognize that name. So it wasn't any deep connection or interest or fascination with the automobile industry?
No, I mean, looking at my sort of the way I game now, I'm much more particular in my choices. And I mean, I think that's by nature. The hobby's grown so incredibly. You sort of have to get into a niche if you're into certain kinds of games. And at this point, I would definitely, I'm a fanboy of certain designers, certain design house publishers, those sorts of things. And I gravitate more towards those than doing these sort of like broad swath, sort of sift through whatever. I'm happy to sort of sit with 4 or 5 different resources to sort of suss out which games I'm interested in. But at the time, no, I was just, hey, I was looking for deep economic kind of games, and that one had surfaced. So,
well, excellent. Yeah, it's a game that actually I kind of was interested in because of the theme. And because it was, it was a Martin Wallace. I mean, at one point I had like Tyros from Martin Wallace. I had White Lotus that I got from Germany. I just kind of, I have a little bit of a sort of weird, obsessive and completionist sort of personality. It's like, if I like something, I'm going to grab everything by them that I possibly can grab. And sometimes that, yields some hidden gems, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
When you look at Automobile, this is a game that I remember was extremely popular when it first came out in 2009. And then it really kind of went through a renaissance when Mayfair reprinted it, because a lot of those early Warfrog games were very hard to get. And they were super expensive in the secondary market. If you didn't get one initially, you weren't probably going to get one. So when Mayfair released it, I think it opened it up to a whole new sort of generation of people playing it, and I think I was one of them. I think the Mayfair edition is the one that I played, so I never had a chance to play the earlier edition. So that puts me at what, 2011, right? Because that's when Mayfair did their edition.
Yeah. And did you get the deluxe, or did you get the standard?
No,
version?
Just the standard. Just the standard version that Mayfair did. And, I was, very happy with it. And I know a lot of people were really taken with the game. And so I was a little surprised when I was preparing for the episode today to see that it's rated like a 7.3 and its rank overall is 371. Now, that's nothing to sneeze at. You're in the top 500. I mean, it's not like I have games in the top 500. So who am I to say that that's not? I just kind of thought that Automobile would have been a little bit higher than that. Especially after my sort of recent playing of it. It kind of reminded me about all of the things that I really enjoyed and liked about the game. So I think it'll be interesting to kind of try to determine what it is that has kind of made the game stick around. Certainly, it hasn't faded away. It's not like it's rated poorly, but it's one that actually I would put on my personal list a little bit higher than it looks like Board Game Geek does. So, well, for people out there who aren't familiar with Automobile, would you be willing to kind of give just sort of a high level view of sort of what the game's about and how the game is played?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll start with sort of the overarching narrative that Wallace has tried to design into this. I think that, like you said, you were drawn to the theme of automobiles, and something that I appreciate about this game now, having played it quite a bit, is that I actually feel like there is a narrative to this. Players are taking on the roles of business heads and investors, essentially in the American car industry, early in the American car industry, 1900 to 1930s. It's the Wild West. It's the Wild West. It's a new market that's emerging in car sales, and players need to capitalize on all the opportunities to make money. And so as business people and investors, I sort of see players as a bit of both. they're also kind of investors in infrastructure and things like that. And we'll talk about that a bit. But players will control automotive production companies. They build and upgrade their factory infrastructure. They create distribution networks for sales. They invest in R&D, and most importantly, of course, they produce and they sell cars in 3 highly competitive markets: the economy, the middle class, and the luxury markets. And those sort of also, there's this sort of growing narrative through the game as time progresses around this, what I sort of see as a tech track of vehicles that, slowly economy cars start to take over the market and luxury cars only enter the market midway through. And it's really fun how I think theme is sort of not something that's overt, but something that this game is just soaking in. I did just a little bit of digging. I decided to send Mr. Wallace a geek mail, and he very kindly responded. I thought that was just fantastic.
Excellent.
Just asking about the history of the game design and what he appreciated about it. So I'll mention some of his comments, but here I just asked, well, what was sort of the inspiration? Why, like, how did you get to this game? And he basically said he spent a lot of time at that period of his game design in old secondhand bookshops looking for inspiration for games. And which is great. I love that. And came across an old book with detailed illustrations of not automobiles, but passenger aircrafts. And I'm sure you're familiar with his other game that includes that sort of theme.
Yep.
Airplanes.
Airplanes, yep. And
Yeah.
then ships. Yeah, the
Exactly.
last one that he did, yeah.
Exactly. And so those images inspired the design, but he didn't at the time have airplanes fully fleshed out. And so he sort of started to consider other forms of transport, and obviously we're now looking back. So he stumbled on to collecting books on automobiles, and I guess the rest is history. He found specifically one book by an artist that had, I think, who ended up doing the illustrations for that Warfrog edition of the actual automobiles, and that was taken from an artist from this book that he found, which is quite great.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting that he kind of looked for that inspiration rather than having that idea in mind to begin with.
I think it's fascinating that in some ways the art and the theme drove the design of the game, which I don't know if that's always typically the case.
No, I don't know that it is. I mean, of course, you're going to get different answers from different designers, and you're going to get probably even different answers from individual designers, such as Martin Wallace, who, some games maybe, like you said, it's that art, it's that, idea that kind of pops out and inspires, or sometimes the idea is there, and then you have to kind of try to structure the game around the idea. So, yeah, all right. So, as you said, you're as a player, you are sort of looking at trying to make the most money. Real simple, right?
Absolutely.
The goal of the game, make
all about money.
Yep. And you're going to do that, as you said, by researching different technologies that will lead to advancements in automotive design. And it's got a really interesting sort of callback to it from Age of Steam, which is this idea of cars almost sort of rusting. They don't ever kind of completely rust the way they do in train games, where locomotives will become obsolete and then you can't use them anymore. But as newer and better cars are kind of researched and then developed and then produced and taken to the market, the older cars kind of start to fall out of popularity. There's not as much demand for them, and so you end up with running a real risk of having maybe some extra inventory that you're going to be taking a loss on, or you're going to end up with these factories that are very antiquated and that are not going to be efficient, as it says in the game, and so that's going to generate more sort of money hemorrhaging from your sort of imaginary automobile empire. And so one of the things that you sort of need to do in this game is shutter your own factories, just close them down as time sort of marches on. And I find that to be a really fascinating part of the game, because the game that I just played, I kind of went against my own normal strategies, and I actually kept a older factory open for almost the entire game and took the hit of the loss each round, because your inefficiency generates loss of revenue. But I was making enough money and not spending a ton of money
Mm-hmm.
on new factories,
Absolutely.
that I actually was able to pull out a win, which was the first time I kind of tried that. It's like, I'm going to be like the sort of Walmart of, automobiles. I'm just going to crank out a bunch of, well, Walmart's probably a bad example, like the Yugo, or, this sort of, I'm just going to crank out these old cars, and people are going, and then I actually made a parts factory for them, which is another thing that you can do in the game. For people who aren't familiar with it, you can build factories, and the more factories you have, the more cars you can produce. But then you also have what's called this parts factory that you can build. And what that does is it reduces the cost of making the cars. So I took the economy model cars. I was the first one to get into that game. And I had skipped by, I think, the first one through research and development, and started the second line of economy cars, and had 2 factories there and a parts factory. So I was producing those cars for like $30 a piece. And it was amazing. I mean, I was churning out like 9 cars every round, and was kind of able to sort of bury everybody under this avalanche of cheap cars while everybody else was looking at the mid-class and the luxury class cars. But then, there's been other times that I played this game where I focused extremely rigidly on luxury class, or, the mid-class car empire. So there's all kinds of different approaches that I've taken to the game. Do you find that there are multiple paths to victory, and multiple strategies that you can employ, or do you end up seeing just a few viable paths? Because that's something that I was kind of curious about, because I had like a favorite strategy that I used all the time, and this game that I just played was one where I went against my own inclinations. What has been your experience with that?
Yeah, well, I think the examples you gave there were perfect. I've seen players try various things. You can be the economy mogul, and what you've done with pumping out a mass number of cars with a parts factory becomes one of these highly efficient, large margin sort of strategies, right? And I think let's just even back up and maybe talk a second about this economy, middle class, and luxury thing, for those who might not know. But around the periphery of the board, in sort of a clockwise fashion, there are production spaces. And each of those production spaces, increases in value. And some of them are middle class, some of them are economy, some of them are luxury. And what I find interesting about the game is there tends to be, once you understand the order, some really key locations. Like you said, you were on the second economy spot, right? That is perhaps a really good a spot to be in. And this is also player dependent as well. I don't know, Jeff, have you played with 5 and 4 and 3 in these with this game?
I have played with all player counts, but the fewest games that I've played have been at the full 5. I usually play 4-3. Okay. I've played 2 with a variant that was okay, but I've only played with 5, I think maybe once or twice, to be honest with you.
Okay, so I've mostly played 5, which is great. We have sort of a bit of a balance there, but yeah, I have seen a variety of strategies. I've seen people going hard to try to monopolize, like some players have in certain games tried to eat up all of the economy spots so that no one else can compete with them, right? But then if you even let one person in and they put on that triple factory, then there's a major threat, especially if they're the most advanced. Middle class, they are going to sell cars throughout the entire game very consistently. I find the middle class is always something I personally like to dabble in. I like to have at least one factory in middle class. I personally find diversification tends to do well for me. But I've also seen a player who won just with luxury cars for the last 2 turns. And again, they sort of ended up with a bit of a monopoly on that one, and were able to leverage one of the character powers, which is Howard, to sell extra cars, and they were able to leverage their distributors to sell cars. Yeah, I have actually seen quite a variety. I prefer to... Well, I like to have an idea of sort of a newish strategy. I mean, I enjoy exploring different possibilities in a game, but then at the same time with this game, that strategy might not work. This game is going to, no matter what you do, be a bit of a tactical experience based on where other players build, right? You can't really come up with a defined plan a long-term plan right at the beginning and the outset of the game. You have to respond to players' decisions all the way through. It's highly interactive in that sense. But yeah, I hope that kind of answers that question. I really do enjoy the myriad ways that you can go about going about.
No, I think you answered that very well. Yeah, and I'm glad to hear that you're also finding some robust kind of paths and different strategies that you can use in order to try to win the game, and some different things to explore. Because one of the things that makes games stick around in our collection is either a sentimental sort of fondness, or a fact that a game can take a ton of repeated plays and you're still finding new things. You're still finding new and better ways, in order to, kind of tweak your own strategy. I do really fully appreciate, though, what you said there, which is that the game is very responsive, right? It's tactical. And, like any other game like this, there's always a high value in doing what everybody else is not. So, in the beginning of the game, there were two people who got into the mid-class cars, and they were immediately in tight competition with each other. And they only kept messing with each other even more. And then both of them got into the luxury market, first one, then the other. Right. And so it was kind of like, okay, these guys and gals are squabbling over this, so I'm going to go for the cheapo cars. And the game kind of pushed me in that direction. And then once I did that, then they responded by opening up more advanced factories later in the game of the cheap cars to try to push me out of the market. But that's when some timely advertising saved me. So there's a couple other elements of the game that I think we should probably just briefly describe to people, which is, you mentioned one of them, which is the character selection. So there is sort of a role selection aspect to the game at the start of every round. The second thing you're going to do is you're going to choose from a set of these personalities that include people like Chrysler and Ford and Durant and Howard and Kettering, and all of these sort of early sort of moguls and giants of the industry here in the United States. Okay, we're not really looking at what was going on over in Europe. For that, get Kraftwagen. It's a great game. But here in the U.S., we're kind of looking at Sloan and all these other sort of people. And so you're going to select one of those roles, and each of those gives you something that you can do that is sort of, as you said, loosely tied to their own sort of story, right? So Ford, for example, if you select Ford, you're going to go first. And he's going to help you a little bit with research and development, but what he's really going to help you do is scale. So Ford allows you to build a factory without having to expend one of your 12 precious actions, because you have 3 actions per round, 4 rounds, and the game's done. So Ford can really help you, but he only lets you build factories where you already have factories. So he's the guy, as you would expect, that's going to ramp up production for you, right? That's what Ford's going to do. Whereas other people are like kings of research and development. And other people are great managers. So they're going to help you manage your loss. And, the things that maybe you did that weren't so efficient, right? So there's each of these different characters has their uses. Howard is kind of a swan song for a lot of people. Not a swan song, a siren song for a lot of people. Because Howard lets you just sell 2 cars to him. Like, he was apparently this legendary salesman who could sell anything, okay? And so if you take Howard, you're going to get to sell, for sure, 2 cars to Howard, right? Regardless of what the rest of the market sort of ends up demanding. And so that's like a really interesting part of the game, because as you said, you can really use that to help you when you're trying to formulate that kind of strategy. For me, for example, I went with, I think it's Chrysler all the way at the bottom, who allows you to eliminate these loss cubes that you have to take for old antiquated equipment or unsold cars. So Chrysler in the 4th round lets you just get rid of 4 of those. So it didn't matter that I was gaining cubes for my old factory. It didn't matter that I didn't sell a couple of cars, because Chrysler wiped all that away for me.
Yeah.
And so that really helped me. So at that moment in the game, he was key for me. Earlier in the game, Ford was key for me. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, and it all depends on which turn.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
I think
have you
like,
found any of these guys are like more useful or less useful to you? I mean, what's your opinion about the role selection?
well, we can come back to, I do want to discuss at some point in time the first turn choice, because there are, I think, ways to open the game depending on which character that you choose. But throughout the game, I wouldn't say there's always a best character. And even for like the first turn, just depending on which character you choose, you can sort of set a first turn direction, but hey, there's a lot of variable paths to take. One thing that we need to talk about these characters, this is how the game creates asymmetry between the players, because there is a static setup, right? The tech track doesn't change from game to game. The distributors just go out into the same spots. It's pretty procedural in many ways, other than the two things. The first thing that you do is you receive these demand chits, which is going to be a little bit of insight. I mean, if you want to think of it a bit more thematically, I guess you sort of get some inside information. Maybe you're doing some research and develop or market research.
Right, market research, yeah.
Yeah, totally, right? And so you have a percentage of knowledge of the possibilities that you can leverage for the rest of your turn. And that already might even influence who you want to take. And I say that because, so the demand tiles, just to be clear, they are numbered 2, 3, 4, and 5, and there are 4 of each number. So there are, yeah, exactly 16 numbers or 16 tiles. So like, let's say you receive 2 5s there on the later, like turn 2, 3, and 4, the tiles are always sorted. Highest goes for, in turn 2, it's middle class, and 3 and 4, it's economy. So you sort of get this average thing where it's really predictable in turn 2, 3, and 4, right? Because if everyone's using their higher tiles, you sort of, and everyone is using their lower tile for the lower, like the economy and the middle class, it becomes a bit more predictable. Whereas in the very first turn, we only draw 1 tile, and it can be quite swingy because everyone is only going to flip that single tile. You're not sorting them high and low. So you have some real power if you have 2 5s or 2 2s. You can sort of determine what you want to do. Now, like you said, the choosing characters, this is the asymmetry part. I think it's the crux of the game. And there's 3 things that are important about the characters. Like you mentioned, they have special powers, which might be the reason that you really want someone for the turn. You might honestly look at turn order as being more valuable than their power, though, and choose someone like Ford or Kettering, or perhaps even Chrysler because he goes last. Turn order is critical in this game. Do you want to build factories later in turn order? Because if you do, you will likely get the most advanced factories. I mean, I actually always like Chrysler. He's one of my favorite characters because, first of all, he gives you 2 R&D, which is just solid. He's going to mitigate losses based on turn number, which is solid. And you get to go last. And I actually like going last for a lot of reasons. One of them is, again, if you're looking to build more technologically advanced factories, he's likely going to be the last one to build in a specific turn. And if you're looking to produce cars, you literally have the last action out of the 3 actions in a given turn to do that. And so you can sort of suss out how many cars people have built, weigh it against what you think the average is, and include your little, bit of insider information. And you have a pretty good guess as to what you want to build. You have a bit of control that way going last in turn order. But maybe you want to go first in turn order because there's the executive actions. And of course, we'll talk about those later. But those are critical little bits of marketing and even mitigating losses. There's a very special little action in there to close a factory. So I think there's 3 different reasons. Do you want R&D cubes? Maybe for the executive actions or for the next turn? I love the character selection piece. I think it's quite brilliant the way Wallace has integrated this into the game.
Yeah, I have to agree with you because it really does seem like it's a crucial 4th decision every round, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not really one of your actions per se, but it kind of is, right?
Absolutely.
Because you have to try and choose, and you have to try and choose somebody wisely. And you can also you also have this effect where at the end of every round, the first person who passes is then going to have the first choice of those characters in the following round.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen people kind of cut short, maybe not do some of the executive actions, because they want to be sure to have their pick of the personalities at the start of the next round, right? So this is, there's all kinds of layers here, right?
There's tense choices all throughout, yeah.
And really, the one criticism that I've heard leveled at the game, I kind of want to throw at you here a little bit, which is that, okay, so you have 3 choices every round, right? You have 3 actions, and your actions can be build a factory, build a parts factory, you can produce cars, right? And you can pass, which I don't know why anybody would do that. You can put out a salesman, which represents your sort of infrastructure, your sales force, your distribution networks, as you've been calling them, right?
Yeah.
And so you have a sort of limited number of actions. Closing a factory, I think, is another one of the actions that you can do. You have a very limited menu of actions, and so what I've heard people say is, well, every turn you're going to want to produce cars.
Yeah, so that's one of the 3.
So that's one of the 3. So you're not actually making 12 decisions. You're really only making, 8 meaningful decisions, because, the third one is always a gimme. And I would kind of argue that the character selection puts that third one back in. I don't know. It's like on credit.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things I constantly think about with this game is its decisions within decisions. That many of these decisions, such as the character, there are, like I said, even just 3 sort of large perspective things: R&D, turn order, player power. Now you get into the other actions like producing or building factories. Well, it's not as simple as just, oh, I'm going to just choose to do one thing. No, you could build 1 or 2 or a parts included, or, and do I want to add it to an existing space that I have it, or do I want to do something new with it? How much R&D do I have? Do I want to spend it here and get more advanced factories? Oh, wait, there's a spot that's open that's a little less advanced, but I don't have to spend my R&D. It's a little bit cheaper. I have to calculate my money because, hey, that would actually save me $200 to produce cars. I might not have to take a loan. Like, what I'm getting at here is there's just so many decisions within that one decision. And I would say even producing cars is, for me, the one place where it's going to happen every turn. I'm going to make at least 4 decisions to produce cars. But the beauty, and this is something I absolutely love about this game, is Wallace has built into this a breadth of decision-making space into each of these actions like this. If you have 1 factory, you have a minimum and a maximum number of cars you can produce in that factory. If you have 2 factories on a space, there's a minimum and maximum. And often I'll get to this place where, well, okay, which factory spaces and how many per space? Minimums, so don't get caught. Like, all of a sudden you have a double factory. And I've seen this happen specifically with luxury cars. Someone has 2 factories producing. You have to do a minimum of 3. And they're like, oh, shoot, I'm never going to sell that third one. So now you either have to choose not to produce any or to produce all 3 and try to figure out a way to sell those things. And then there's the maximums as well, right? Like, if you have just a bunch of 1 factories, you're not going to be able to produce very much. But hey, you could produce cars twice. Take 2 actions in the segment of 3 actions to produce.
That's madness.
No, it is absolutely. I have found it is one of the most perfect strategies if you want to save your infrastructure money, right? So if you set yourself up with sort of I'd call it like a spread out factory model where you have just 1 factory in multiple segments. So let's say you have 1 in economy, you have 1 in luxury, maybe you have 2 in middle class, and you leave them there and you produce twice in a turn. And you might even decide to produce on your first action. And what's really fun about that is you scare people.
Exactly.
So you sort of throw cars out on the board and everyone's like, shoot, I don't know if I can produce as much now because there's already this many. And then they've produced some and you maybe produce again and freak them out. But you're sort of positioning yourself to control the sales. And it, again, just depends what you've done. Maybe you have a parts factory and you, maybe not other players, can afford to discount all your vehicles in that certain segment, and you're forcing other people to discount their vehicles, it's a much greater loss for them than it is for you. There's just all sorts of positioning in that sort of a thing with producing cars. I find it's a bit of a like flexing your muscles kind of a thing.
It's funny that you say that, because I first of all, I think that all of those observations are very astute, because I've seen that done. I haven't seen the produce cars twice, but I have seen the spread out sort of factory sort of strategy where it's like, they don't ever produce, they don't ever make a second factory, and everything is just singles. And
something I like about that, sorry to interrupt here, but something I like about single factories, Jeff, you mentioned one of the actions is closing factories. There's always for me a tension between how long do I keep a factory open to accrue these loss cubes in your example that you gave earlier here in the episode, and closing that factory, because when you close a factory, you get money back, which you can then, again, invest in newer factories or for whatever purpose you might want, but it's less $100 of the cost that you put into it. And so, okay, well, I'm getting losses and I'm paying for them if I keep it open, but I'm kind of losing money if I close it. And I always warn new players, I say, if you're going to build 2 or 3 factories on a single production space early on, just be wary. You want to keep that thing as open as long as possible, because if you close it, you're not losing just $100, you're losing $300 potentially. And you have to think, if that factory space over its life cycle of 3 turns maybe produced you or netted you $700 in cash, but then you close it and lose $300 in cash, its net value as a production space went way down. Whereas those single spaces, when you close a single factory, you're only losing $100. And you know what? When you close a factory, whether it's 3 or whether it's 1, you half your loss cubes. So you get the same loss cube mitigation effect. So, there's a lot to think about in terms of setting yourself up. I actually don't mind having single factories, even quite, far down on the tech track, because they're great loss cube mitigation later in the game.
That's an excellent point as well. Yeah. I was also referring to your sort of flexing your muscle. And I kind of have, in that last game that I played, I definitely was using my production as to kind of bully people. I was like, I'm making 9 cars, boom. And I just like laid them on the space, and everybody's kind of like looking, and they're like, oh my God, even though my cars were older, because those, it's intimidating. And because those demand chits that you pull in the 3rd and 4th round, I believe it is, I think it's the 3rd and 4th round, the high value chit goes towards the economy cars. You kind of try to do a little bit of math, and you're like, okay, so let's say an average of 3. So an average of 3 with, 4 people. So that's 12. He just made 9. So either he's an idiot and he's going to lose a lot of money, or it's probably, he's got a big sales force too. Like, one of the things that I noticed is that when I played this last thing, and I hate to keep referencing that one play, but it was something where I was really going against type for me, is because I wasn't spending a lot of actions to build new factories. I was constantly adding to my sales force.
Absolutely.
So I had almost all of my salesmen out.
And you probably didn't have to take as many loans, perhaps.
I didn't take any loans. Yeah. I mean, it was a beautiful thing.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, the guessing the demand thing, and again, being the first to produce is fun, because like you said, you can sort of flex and like scare people off maybe, and they might. Honestly, it's a bit of posturing, and I find this game, I just have to make an aside here, intensely funny. Every time I'm playing it with my group, we are just jabbing at each other and constantly like, oh, you should produce a few more. Why don't you do the max? I mean, that's the most efficient thing to do. You should probably do that, and just these little
trying to talk them into bankruptcy. Nice.
Oh, absolutely. You play the business person as well as you can. You're conniving. You're absolutely going to try to eke out the thing that's going to work best for you. But like you said, you sort of are trying to gauge the average demand. And I think that's an important thing to be aware of. But I've played games, and maybe this is like the culture of the game, how it develops. But I've played games where every player just sort of falls into a conservative pattern of like, well, if the average number of sales for economy cars is going to be about 20, then we kind of all produce collectively about 20. But I've been in games where people start to drive that, and pretty soon you realize there's 30 cars on the board and the average is 20. So, multiple people are getting screwed.
Somebody's going to lose hard there. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's where I think a lot of fun comes into play.
Have you ever had any negotiation in it? Because we do. Like my group, like when people will try to kind of edge into my market, right? I'll just kind of look at them and be like, okay, listen, if you do that, this is what I'm going to do. It's like, I have the money to max produce. You're pretty much bankrupting yourself by building that factory, and I'm going to crush it. You're going to produce nothing. This isn't really a good plan for you. Or, what I said in another game I played, because I had a large sales force, it was just like, I'm just going to use my salespeople, and I'm just going to outsell you. You don't have any, you have one, or I think they had one or two salespeople. And I was just like, I'm going to crush you under my enormous sales force. And I'm just going to sell, cars, and you're going to be left over with a lot of inventory. So you might want to rethink that. Like that's sort of threatening, negotiating kind of, bare knuckles kind of stuff. Do you find your group kind of engages in any of that kind of brinksmanship, or trying to make deals with other players as far as what market segment they're going to get into, or kind of threats and things of that nature? Or is that just us that are being mean to each other?
No, absolutely. I think our group enjoys good table talk, and like I said, it just adds to the humor and overall enjoyment of games for me and for us as a group. And so every time we get this on the table, I feel like we have great discussion afterwards. We're laughing intensely throughout the game, and you sort of walk away from the night and you think this was just a great social time, as well as game. Like you work the social, you work the sort of cognitive. It's quite a lot of fun in that regard.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. And, one of the other things I want to highlight is this sort of track that you mentioned going around the board. So starting with the earliest models of cars, going around to the most advanced, right? So the earliest and the most advanced are kind of right next to each other, okay? But you have to go all the way around the board to get to the most advanced, okay? And you're always having to move, as you said earlier, in a clockwise direction, right? What I find like really fascinating is like, when it comes time to sell the cars, there are so many complex sort of systems that could have been designed to simulate the higher demand for the more technologically advanced cars, while the older cars suffer in sales because, they don't have the shine they once had in the eyes of the consumers. Like you could have had this like really complex thing. He just brilliantly had this system where it's like, okay, so you're going to look like, what's the most advanced car? That's going to sell first. And then you're going to work your way around until you get to the least advanced car. Those are then going to sell last, right? And like, I just find that to be like a really, it's an overused word nowadays, elegant, but like a really, really simple way to simulate market conditions that seem to hold true historically, and from my own experience, right? Newer is always better in the eyes of most consumers. And so, but it's like right there in front of you. Like it's so easy to do it. And I really appreciate that about the design. Do you have any sort of thoughts or comments about how he kind of handles this idea of demand for models being based upon their, age and newness, and, or is that just something that I'm kind of geeking out about?
No, I love that. I think there are specifically some segments where that's really important, like the luxury, because the luxury in the third and fourth round, those are the only rounds where you're going to draw one chit, right? And so it's a bit of a risk. How many of these are going to sell? And I mean, if you have the one that's the highest technology, you're guaranteed to sell something, right? So luxury can be a high risk if you are farther down that tech tree, unless of course you've worked it out with your distributors and with Howard and those sorts of things. I guess there's three things you're making me think about here in regards to sales. I mean, one of them is is like you're saying, the most advanced will sell very first, but then it goes on these sorts of passes, right? Like you'll sell in one pass and then the second pass. And so what you have to sort of do is posture yourself with marketing and discounts. And I think this is one of the brilliant things is you might be first to sell, but there's someone else who has a boatload of cars that they're going to sell when it comes to their space, and it might not make it around to you again. And I find that just a really fun part of the game is figuring out where to put my, again, decisions. You know, it's not just those three actions, these executive actions of where to put the marketing or where to put the discounts can really affect the way that cars are sold on the board.
And I think this is a great time to talk about those. So right towards the end of the round, you're going to have what are called these executive decisions. And this is before you go to the demand chits, right? So you can sell cars beforehand, if you want to think of it that way, with your sort of sales force, right?
Yeah.
They're going to sell cars in the showrooms, you know, whatever, or, you know, Howard's going to sell cars for you. But then what's going to happen is before you kind of see what the rest of the market's going to bear, right? And you kind of reveal those demand chits and you kind of count up, okay, this is how many midsize can sell, this is how many economy can sell, et cetera. You have the opportunity to take these executive actions. And so the executive actions, again, are going to be kind of round robin. They're going to be in turn order, right? And your choices are, you can invest research and development, which, you know, in this case, I'd say it's just market research into advertising, right? And the first person to take advertising, which I find fascinating, is it's much more expensive. It's going to cost you 2 of your research and development cubes in order to be the first person to advertise, right? And then there's other opportunities. What is there? 2 more, I think, to advertise. But it's only cost you 1 research and development cube, right? So you have the opportunity to advertise, which means when it comes around to your cars to be sold, instead of selling just 1, you're going to sell 2, right? And you also have the opportunity to discount, right? And discounted cars, that's going to give you a whole nother advantage. Now, you might think to yourself, well, I'm now selling them for less than they're supposed to. So, you know, I might be making normally $100 on an economy car, but now I'm only going to be making, what is it, 75, right? Or something like that. I'm trying to remember exactly
70.
what it was. It's 70. Now I'm only going to be making 70, right? Well, with my parts factory, it only cost me 30. So therefore, I'm still turning a profit. But with the advantage of discounting my cars, that's also going to allow them to sell and maybe leave someone else, my opponent, stuck with a whole huge inventory of cars that they can't move.
Absolutely.
And so that's a whole nother sort of layer. And then you made reference earlier to the fact that there's a closure. Your executive action can be to close one of your production spaces, right?
Yeah,
and that's shutter your factories. Yeah,
that's such a sought after token because, you know, if you don't get that in the executive actions, you're spending 1 of your 12 actions at least during a game. Typically, more you want to close than even just 1 space, probably. So it's it's a highly sought after tile, that free factory close, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, and it's something that definitely it can give you some extra revenue to kind of kickstart you for the next round. And you know, it's one of those things that, like you said, it's another layer of decisions, and even a decision to pass and not take any executive actions. Well, that lets you go first.
Yeah,
and that can be impactful, right? Really that can be very important for you. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. So, you know, even though it's billed as a game with only 12 decisions, right? And, you know, so X number of them are automatic because you're always going to produce. As you said, there's like decisions within those decisions that really do kind of add to the robustness of the gameplay, right? So while, as you said, the game is very sort of procedural, it's procedural during the sales, it's procedural just in how it looks, just in, you know, it's a track going around a board, for God's sake, right? It's very procedural, time marches on kind of a thing, right? And you can spend those research and development cubes to kind of skip over spaces to kind of jump ahead of your competition and open up a more advanced kind of facility to make a newer model car, but that's going to cost you. I mean, those research and development cubes are not easy to come by.
Absolutely.
And then, as you said earlier, which I thought was an excellent point, you're also opening up opportunities for someone else to kind of jump in. And it's like, okay, so I might have spent a lot of research and development to jump up to the next level of luxury car. But in doing so, I passed two mid-size, car manufacturing spaces and just kind of left them sitting there. Yeah. And so now someone else can kind of swoop in and say, oh, well, cool. I didn't have to spend any of my own R&D to get to this more advanced mid-size. Thank you very much. Hats off to you, right? And you did that grunt work for me, and now I'm just going to kind of swoop in there and reap the rewards and maybe open up a factory myself and become more competitive. So there's all kinds of interesting jockeying for position when it comes to just about everything in this game, whether it's the turn order or the number of factories, the number of cars. Yeah, there's all kinds of interesting things going on.
Well, we should let's talk. We've mentioned the distributors. I call them distributors. I think they call them salespeople in the manual.
Right.
But I sort of like to imagine it as setting up your distribution network. It just seems to me a bit more larger scale sort of operation. But I think, okay, so we've talked about infrastructure building, and I think that interconnects with car manufacturing and sales and technology. There's a whole bunch of things going on there, like systems that are woven together. But then there's a whole marketing game going on that's sort of a second layer. And we've already mentioned there's part of the marketing game exists in these executive actions by advertising or discounting, right? That's kind of like a part of the marketing strategy, because you may have produced more cars than you should have, but you did it for a reason, because you knew you were going to go first and take that double discount, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of things to think about. But then the other big part of your marketing strategy, if you want to call it that, is putting out those distributors. And if you think about it, there are, 10 slots in economy, there are 7 slots in middle class, and there are 6 in luxury. And each of those sales that you can make, so each distributor that slides over and takes one of those slots will sell one car in each of those segments. And that I sort of see as part of the marketing game, because you may have overproduced because you have a boatload of distributors versus everyone else. If you're not keeping up with other players in the marketing aspect of the game, aka putting distributors out, I think you are going to fall behind, because every incremental little bit that you get ahead through this game, every sale that you make is going to add up. This game is win by cutting the other person 1,000 times. It's not win by some giant big move. It's win by these tiny little sneaky pieces. And I find even with the distributors, like we said with the executive actions, hey, we overproduce cars, so who's going to take the loss? Well, hey, in putting out distributors, we have too many distributors for the number of slots there are. Oh, whoops, I guess I put out too many. Someone's going to lose one at the end and take a loss cube for it. There's a great little strategy behind that. And even the strategic significance in the distributor phase of sales of, which slot am I going to go into? Am I going to move this guy up and go luxury, or down and go economy? Because I know that, Chris over there is selling a lot of economy, and I want to take as many possible economy slots as I can, because that means when he has to sell during the market phase, he may be expected to sell 4 now, but he only sold 2. Like these kinds of decisions are just all over the place. And I love it.
Yeah, they definitely are. You're absolutely correct about that. And that movement of the sales force, I think, is another bullying tactic.
Yes.
And it's one that I've used to kind of get people to not do what I don't want them to do. Is I'm like, hey, if you really force me to, I'm just going to move my sales force up to, mid-size. And I'm just going to produce a bunch of, mid-size, because I do have that one factory sitting over there. And I'm going to take away, opportunities for you to sell.
Absolutely.
Do you really think that demand's going to be good enough for you to sell all those cars you made? I don't know. Mine's more advanced. I think I'm going to sell before you're going to sell. So why don't you think about that before you get into this, And so there's all these kind of interesting as you said, ways to kind of, again, it's jockeying for position, right? The fact that you can move those salespeople, you know, that distribution sort of network, however you want to sort of imagine it thematically, in game terms, that fluidity allows you to kind of get yourself out of trouble or put somebody else in trouble, right?
Yes.
And I think it's also really important to highlight the thing that you just said, which is the notion of it's a death by 1,000 cuts, right? You're not going to make, you know, this huge killing in one turn that's going to win you the game. And it's often not only the decisions that you make, but it's also the decisions that you don't make, like the things that you choose not to do.
Well
you know, like I thought about, you know, in many games, like I am never the guy to push development hard in one direction. Like I choose what horse I'm going to ride, and I try to do some diversification, but I kind of decide early on in that first round based on, as you said, what the other players are doing. Am I going to go luxury? Am I going to go mid-size? Am I going to go economy? Right. And then once I've chosen that horse, I don't push a lot of development, and I'm not always seeking the newest, shiniest thing, because here's the thing. Let's say I open up a mid-size factory, right? And it's the most advanced. Well, by the time they're the most advanced, it's like $650 to open one factory. Now, at the end of the game, you do get full value. If you haven't had to close it, you do get full value back. But I'm still having to outlay $650 to build this. So now I've built this factory, which has limited capacity. But because it cost me so much to build it, now I'm stuck with the decision. Do I take a loan so that I can max out the production of this brand new shiny model to try to make some money, because the game's only 4 rounds long? Or do I stick with the limited amount of money I have, and I only sell a couple of cars this round, but maybe I can sell more next round? And what I find is that's a losing proposition, right? The amount of capital that you're spending is not, you're not getting enough return on it. Well, and so therefore, sometimes it's better not to do that and to kind of stick with and ride the horse you have. And remember that at the end of the game, you're going to count money. So whoever has the most money is going to be the winner. So, you know, that death by 1,000 cuts really sort of equates to sales more than it does modern factories and latest, greatest models. Does that make any sense?
Well, it does. I will provide one counter, because I've seen it done really well, where let's say turn 2 or 3, I've sort of established my factory presence and really don't want to expand because it's going to push me into the loan zone, you know? But other players have seen that and pound out, let's say I'm in middle class, for instance, 2 or 3 more advanced factories. Like we wrap all the way around the corner of the board. All of the middle class are eaten up. And now I'm going to all of a sudden incur 4 loss cubes this 4th turn, which equates to, like, you know, $160 loss for me. And so while they've taken a loan and perhaps, you know, had to, now they have a loss on the loan because they have to pay it back and all that, but they've leveraged first to sale. They've perhaps built the right amount. They have taken the right advertising. There's just like, there's cuts that can go the other way too. And it's so situational. I don't know, honestly, which strategy is better. And I've seen both employed to great effect. I will say, in the last half dozen games we've had, and we've played this quite a bit over the summer, many players are winning taking 2 loans, and even as early as turn 2, which is insane. And I didn't think it was possible because of the amount of interest that you'd be incurring throughout the game. I mean, it's a $500 loan, right? And you're incurring $50 a turn. So that's, let's say you took a turn 2, $150 of interest, plus you got to pay that thing back at $600 instead of $500. So you've just paid $250 on a $500 loan. You know, and what if you did that twice? But the possibilities, again, of leveraging that money for the technological advances to push not only your advantage in the sales, but also the loss cubes on other players, sometimes is the incremental difference in the game. I also need to say, and this game has been so much fun, partly because we've been learning it together. We've been playing as a same group. And again, in the last half dozen plays, there have been 3 games within $40. That's 1 loss cube at the end of the game.
Wow, that's impressive.
Between first and second. And you think, talk about micro decisions. Like if I would have been able to mitigate 1 loss cube somewhere, or perhaps someone forced 1 loss cube on me somewhere, that was the game. That was actually the game. And so when it comes down to these, $100 or less margins of victory, your decision making needs to be so precise.
No, yeah, I would totally agree with that. And
I hope that's a helpful counter. Yeah, I also agree.
No, sure, absolutely.
There have been great strategies and games I've seen people sit on factories and not take the loan. Like I'm saying, there either way, it might be a good reason for it.
Right,
that's part of the fun of it.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the loans, because this is the one Martin Wallace game where I generally don't like I'm loan averse, right? I don't like to take loans in this game because of the interest and then the penalty when you pay it back right at the end of the game. And maybe I just haven't played around with it enough. I mean, there's definitely games of his, like, London, the first edition of London. Yes. One of the first things I did was take, the max loan I could. Brass, take a loan right away.
Double loan it if you want
to. Just take a massive amount of debt and a massive amount of money, because that's going to sort of fuel your growth, and you're going to make that up, later as the game goes. And it might be that this game is just a little too short for me, that I kind of panic. I worry a little bit that I'm not going to be able to get enough positive sort of gain out of that debt. But you're telling me that people have done it to great effect, so that's a strategy that I'll have to definitely check out, because a lot of times I kind of feel like Martin Wallace, he includes things like crushing debt. I used to always make a joke, well, it's not a Martin Wallace game if you don't have the opportunity to get into crushing debt. It's exactly. Just, but I often think, and he usually has some sort of loss or poverty or, something negative that you have to deal with, right? Whether it's in London or whether it's here in Automobile. And it's kind of, I often think that those are kind of like made to scare you, but they're not so scary if you manage them well. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Yeah. Very much.
And so. I haven't had the opportunity to play around with that, I guess, in Automobile, or I've shied away from it. But man, I've gotten to the point with, London and games like that where, and Brass, where it's like, I don't worry about debt.
You get comfortable.
I don't worry about it. I don't worry about poverty cubes. I worry about it towards the end of the game. But, I remember the first time that I was playing London, for example, and I think it was my wife who looked over at me and she said, well, you don't have to have no poverty. You just need to be close to the amount that the lowest player has,
Exactly.
So if the player at the table, the lowest is 6 poverty, I wouldn't even worry about the first 5 or 6 poverty, because that's all going to basically get wiped away anyway. It's like, oh yeah, I kind of forgot about that. So he kind of builds in these ways to deal with it. And I've seen it very clearly in other games, a little less so in Automobile, because I haven't tried it myself. So shame on me. Good for you. I'm glad you brought that up, because I haven't really tried that yet myself.
I don't like taking the second loan. I'm very willing to take the first, even as early as turn 2, if it means certain things, whether I'm building in exactly the factory space I want, or if I'm producing X number of cars more than I could have, then I'll take the loan. Yeah, for sure. But I think like you said, you feel the sting of the loan in this game a bit more, because something like Brass, you feel it right up front, right? And in this game, you feel the loan every turn. You're paying for it. You're paying for it. You're paying for it. And you sort of look ahead and you think, oh, this is going to be painful. But no, it can be, I'd say specifically for luxury car investors, something that becomes a fairly critical decision, just because those cars are so expensive to manufacture, like $100 a pop, especially if you are in maybe 2 segments, and you want to produce, let's say 5 or 6 luxury cars, that's gonna be $500-600. And you might not always have that cash on hand, especially if you just bought new factories, like you said. Oh man, that factory, $650, well, yeah, you're probably gonna need a loan at that point in time to do your strategy justice.
Right.
So,
right.
we're sort of already talking about, I sort of broke down this game when I thought about it from a meta perspective, and there were three things that seemed really clear. One of them, like I said, was the marketeering with the distributors, with the executive actions. One of them is the infrastructure / sales component to this whole thing. And then the other thing Wallace has done is there's a third level or layer to this game, which is just mitigating loss. And there's losses that you get from loans by paying interest. Of course, there's advantages and gains you get from it as well. But there's losses you get from being inefficient or perhaps being bullied out of the distributors. There's losses you get when you were overproducing cars and were not able to sell them. And then there's various ways to mitigate all these losses. And so I thought maybe it would be good for us to just chat about that quickly too, because I think that's especially in the latter two turns. If we talk about micro decisions again, the loan fee, or sorry, the loss cube fee increases from 10 to 20 to 30 to $40 each turn. And so a pile of 7 loss cubes on turn 1 doesn't feel as painful as a pile of 7 loss cubes on turn 4.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, because, you know, as you said, they just get more and more expensive. And it takes a bigger and bigger bite out of your profits, especially when your margins might be shrinking because you're having to discount the cars. So I made a luxury car for 100. I can sell it for 200, but I have to discount it. So now I'm kind of cutting into my own margin. And then, oh, by the way, I have to pay $80 or, you know, $120 in loss cubes. Oh, yeah. That's going to really sort of wipe you out pretty quickly. So, yeah, I mean, I think the idea of those as sort of this constant threat, and also as a way to kind of push the game forward, because, you know, if you're not under the threat of inefficiency and loss and lack of popularity for an older model of car, then there would be no reason to ever really close the factory. Mm-hmm. You know, you have to, that sort of time track going around the board is what puts pressure on the players in order to avoid the loss, right? So half of mitigating your loss is avoiding the loss. And so this is what drives a lot of people to close factories or take that executive action where you're going to close the factory, right? Because for people who aren't familiar with it, what you basically do is you look at each different class of car and you say, okay, where's the most advanced mid-size car? Okay. Mid-class car. So there it is. Okay. So that one is fine. Then what's the next, going backwards in time? What's the next one that I see? Okay, there it is. That one's okay too. But the next one, you're going to get, what is it? I think 1 loss cube, right? And then if there's one further back from that, it's 2. And if there's one further back from that, it's 3. Mm-hmm. And so you can rapidly get to a point where, you know, you're having to spend so much of your profits on getting rid of these loss cubes because you have to get rid of them. You have to basically pay money to get rid of them at the end of the round if you haven't selected one of those characters that helps you get rid of loss cubes, which is a mitigating factor, right? Yep. And so what a lot of people will do is they'll say, okay, well, I need some influx of cash. I just opened this new factory. I know I want to produce cars there. I don't really have enough money, but if I close this factory, I'm going to not get hit with a loss cube for that factory, and it's going to give me X amount of dollars, which I can put towards the production of these new cars. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I mean, like you said, you can actually. Here's one of the problems with diversification. I've been in the position where I have an economy and a middle class, maybe even a luxury, and then you're getting loss cubes for all 3 segments. Or perhaps I'm in 2 middle class production spaces, but they're further down. So one of them incurs 3 and the next 4. And all of a sudden in one turn, I'm gaining 7 to 10 loss cubes because a variety of my factories are behind on the tech tree, right? And so that closing a production space becomes a critical decision because, like you said, you mitigate taking the cubes, which is great. So now I've sort of saved myself 4 loss cubes, let's say, for example. But then you also immediately half the loss cubes that you have on hand. And so it can sort of be a double whammy in terms of mitigating your loss, right? Like you not only don't get them, but you get to get rid of the ones that you have existing. I really love the timeliness of that. And sometimes if you pair that on the same turn as, like, let's say in the 4th turn, you know, you have quite a quite a boatload of these cubes, and you might, in fact, as your strategy for the final turn, take 2 of your 3 actions to close production spaces to mitigate all the lost cubes that you've incurred. Plus, you might have taken Sloan to then again cut your lost cubes in half at the very end, and you might only end with a handful of lost cubes, like 2 or 3, and if you have saved yourself $300, that might be the game, right? So your 4th turn, in fact, might be the game-winning decision may be just mitigating.
You go out of business, right?
Maybe going out of business.
You're going out of business. Yeah,
cutting your losses while everyone else is taking them, right?
Giving yourself the golden parachute. Yeah, and that's absolutely right, because one of the things that you didn't mention in that scenario is you're also getting money. So,
yes.
Every time you close one of those factories, you're getting money, and money is victory, right? So you're avoiding having to pay a lot of money for lost cubes, and you're accumulating money, which is going to help you perhaps win the game. So those razor thin margins between your first, second, third place and all that in the game often comes down to small decisions like that might seem counterintuitive, or why would you close instead of just cranking out as many cars as you can and selling them? Well, it's because I can kind of see, my chits that I drew are 2s, and I see, I don't know there's going to be the demand there. There's a lot of people who are producing cars in the segments that I produce in, and I've got this accumulation of cubes. So yeah, I can totally see why you would do what you just described, which is basically use your last turn to shut stuff down and just kind of coast across the finish line. And you might end up on top because of that decision, because other people who are trying to crank out as much profit as they can are accumulating lost cubes still and paying the highest possible price in the last round of the game, which could end up, losing them the game. So lots of different, as you said, layers. There's definitely a lot of layers to this game. And this is why I kind of was a little surprised at its rating and a little surprised at its ranking. Now, we all know we're living in sort of, overload in the hobby right now, and sort of cult of the new, and whatever phrase you want to use for it. I mean, as you said, you almost have to become a little bit of you have to sort of pick your niche, because there's just too many games out there to even play to get to experience them all. So, this is a game I would definitely say, if you like economic games, if you enjoy a game that plays in a reasonable playtime, again, it's a crunchy game, but once you have a table full of people who know how to play this, you can crank this puppy out really quickly.
It's a quick playing game. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's definitely a selling point. A lot of it's easy to set up. I know that sounds kind of silly, but in the kind of day and age that we're in with gaming right now, there are some games that take me, 15, 20 minutes to set the stupid thing up. Now, I enjoy the game and I love playing it, but there will be times when I'll be like, not today. I just don't feel like dealing with all that, right? Whereas this one, it's just kind of like, throw the board on the middle of the table, and you're ready to go within 5 minutes. So it's got that advantage to it as well. It does what it does, I think, extremely well. And I think, as you said, there's a narrative to it, and it feels very thematic and interactive. You feel like you're in that knife fight in a telephone booth with the other players, because the margins are so small, because the decisions are limited, and every one of them, therefore, is consequential, which is, I think a real strength of the game. Is there anything else that you kind of wanted to sort of highlight or talk about as far as the game goes before we kind of draw our discussion of this thing to a close tonight?
Well, it was really exciting to talk about. I think we talked quite broadly about the game. I mean, it's just got a lot going on. One thing that I often think about is this game is so interwoven. There's some games I play that feel much more, how could I even say it? Like linear, or perhaps piecemeal. Like I do this thing over here and this thing over here, but they don't necessarily like that thing is going to get me points and this thing is going to get me points. And it's good that I do all those different things.
So what do you have against Stefan Feld?
I'm not pointing out any designers.
Yes, you are.
No.
Yes, you are. But no, I know exactly what you're talking about. Where it's like there's this area of the board and there's this area of the board, and you can do this thing over here, and they're sort of loosely tied together, but they're not really interconnected, right?
Yeah.
And your argument is that Automobile is. Why?
Every layer of this game is interconnected. Your decision of which character to take influences which production space to build in, influences R&D, influences marketeering and production. Like it's these decisions within decisions. And I just find it's so tasty. You know, the level of interaction between players, the depth of decision making, something that I really appreciate about this game, and maybe it's just design philosophy, is this simplicity without complexity, but it's not an easy game. In fact, every time I play it, I think I say it at the table for myself and for everyone else. I just say, like in the middle of thinking and my brain is like smoking out my ears, and I say, this game is hard. I say that every game I play. This game is so hard to play well. You know, I can so easily make mistakes and fail, and these super small margins that you're trying to eke out. But I love that. I love that it's so difficult to play well. I can't puzzle it out. I can't create my efficiency engine. I can't do anything perfect because it's actually so hard to figure all of that out based on the things that other players do. And I think this is possibly a critique some people would level at this game, the randomness of the chits that are drawn. But that factor alone makes this game such a great business simulator. I mean, what business out there can exactly know all that's going to happen in terms of their production and in terms of what they're going to sell? You know, if you're a sort of retail outlet, or like, you know, if we talk about the board game industry, does a certain publisher, are they able to exactly, besides, you know, maybe Kickstarter style? I mean, this is why publishers are doing things that are a bit more certain. Business is hard, you know, estimating, guessing, and all these kinds of skills that go into it. And so that's something I really love about this. It is, for me, my favorite, one of my favorite sort of economic games. I enjoy Container. I think this one is just more interesting. I enjoy 18xx games quite a lot. I find this one just feels a little different. And as I'm saying this game just feels different than any other game on my shelf. And that alone is worth keeping it and worth playing it, because it does something just special. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Oh, well, I find that I'm in agreement with you, which is rather boring for the listeners, but you know, I think it's just true. You know, this game kind of harkens back to an era where the complexity was in the gameplay and the decisions and not in the systems, right? And I'm finding as I'm getting older and grumpier that I really am kind of going back to some of these games that have that sort of complexity based on the interactions with the other players and the way the systems in the game interact, and not so much in how the game itself is structured, right? Not so much in, well, I'm going to have, you know, 12 different systems all going on in this game. It's really kind of simple as far as how to play it. How to play it well is a completely different thing, right? Which is what you're alluding to. Absolutely. And so I think that's one of the things that makes the game really strong, and one of the reasons why it's still in my collection as well. So a couple last things I just want to kind of throw at you there for real quick. We're going to do some rapid fire question and answer. Here we go. Ready? Okay. Best player count?
5, I think, and then 4. I'm willing, but not really interested at 3.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Next, ships, airplanes, aviation ascendant, and automobile. Rank them.
Well, this is a problematic question because I haven't played ships or airplanes. So it's by default automobiles.
Automobile. Well, if it makes you feel any better, automobile might probably at the top of the list for me. Ships is very much automobile, but with like a map, right? And with some other things going on. And the interesting thing there is there's a 2-layer progress progression. That sounds like a really weird thing to say, but you know how the tech tree of the different cars goes around, and that's simulating progress of design. You have the same thing with ships. There's progress and design of ships, but then there's also sort of this progression on the map as you start off in sort of the cradle of civilization, sort of Mediterranean area, and then you're kind of rapidly expanding outward, right? So eventually you can, end up all the way over at the New World, and so there's a progress sort of evolutionary sort of track going on the board as well as on the frame of the board with your ship design, which is kind of interesting. I like that. Aeroplanes is probably, though, my second favorite. And Aeroplanes has been knocked a lot for the dice, right? There's dice rolling. And the dice rolling determines whether or not you're successful in figuring out a route to get from one location to another. And a lot of people really strongly dislike that randomness, in the same way that, some people you indicated have a problem with the randomness of the chit pull system here, right? And the dice rolling is much more pronounced in Aeroplanes, but it's much more, I don't know, to me it always felt very thematic, because aviation was, especially in the early days, very risky and sort of an unknown. How do you get a route? Like how, what's involved in trying to be the first airline to fly from London to Zanzibar? How do you do that? What's involved in that? And so the sort of dice rolling that you are doing to sort of determine whether or not you're successful in making this route, to me, is sort of, again, it's an imagination thing, right? It's the range of the plane, right? The design of the plane, but it's also the infrastructure of airports, right? And the demand of passengers to go from one place to another. And, whether or not you're going to be able to kind of put all those things together to make a profitable airline route is a bit of a roll of the dice, especially in these early days of aviation. So I really kind of enjoyed that. And I think that's a really solid game that's been overlooked because of, I think, a sort of a distaste for dice. You got to remember, I think Airplanes came out before the dice revolution, right? I'd have to kind of look up like games like Castles of Burgundy compared to Aeroplanes, right? Because, dice for so long, at least for me, I don't want to speak for you, was kind of a dirty word, right? It kind of took me back to the days of Risk and Monopoly, where what happens to me is solely dependent on the roll of the dice. But modern games have introduced dice as, action sort of selection, or dice. Yes, there's the luck of the dice, but you can mitigate the dice rolls in some way or another. You can change the die rolls. There's, things like that. And, like, for example, in Castles of Burgundy, you can spend workers to change the die face, right? That's new. That's dice manipulation, right? That's a more modern design sort of an idea that sort of brought dice back into gaming in a very large scale, right? And I kind of think that this game fits in with those, because there's ways to mitigate your die results. But for some reason, it kind of didn't get credit for that. And it didn't really get the sort of reception that I think maybe it deserved. I mean, Joel Eddy and I talked about it at length when it first came out, because there was a lot of hate being heaped on that game. And he and I kind of enjoy it, to be honest with you. So if you, for me, then the ranking would be Automobile, and then Aeroplanes, and, probably Ships last. So, that was just kind of something I was curious about. And the final question, here we go. Warfrog or Mayfair?
In terms of this particular game?
Yeah, in terms of Automobile, like the aesthetics of it.
Yeah, I've looked at the Warfrog, and I think I prefer the Mayfair. It's just got a more period evocative sort of art style. The muted colors are a little bit I think, more coherent. The Warfrog seems a little bit less design integrated. I guess that's how I would sort of look at it. But again, I haven't played on the board. I've only looked at pictures of it. I do have to say, those little wooden distributors and little wooden cars look really cool.
They do. Yeah,
I think the wooden bits are better probably, but the overall art and design aesthetic is probably better in the Mayfair edition.
So. Well, this is the first time you and I are going to disagree. So I would vote for the Warfrog. To me, it's a cleaner look, and there's much less visual kind of clutter. I find that sometimes it's difficult when you have those sort of stylized sort of boards in the art direction you're talking about. It's either going to connect with a player, or it might be a little bit of a distraction. And I kind of find that, for me at least, the Mayfair edition is a little bit sort of difficult to read at times. Whereas, you know, the old school Martin Wallace boards, like, I mean, you know, one of the ugliest boards in the world is Princes of the Renaissance, right? Like, that's just the worst board ever. But it's super easy to read. It's super easy to see what's going on. And, you know, that was back in Martin Wallace's kind of design period where, you know, he never met a table that he didn't like, you know, and there's just tables all over the boards.
Yes.
And
this game is all full of tables too.
Oh, yeah. But I love that because it means I don't have to look stuff up in the rule book all the time because it's right there in front of me.
Yeah.
So I'm one of the people that kind of likes that. And I like the kind of the brighter kind of color palette on the Warfrog. So I was just kind of curious where you felt on that. But
I mean,
for me, it's just a little bit easier to read the board.
Yeah, well, that's fair. I think something I will just say here too is I like that all the information is on the board. I think all of the player information, like all the decisions everyone makes, everything is centralized. No one has a separate player board. I love player boards and I love building my own little thing, but I love that all the information is centralized. You can parse everything at a glance. It's just a really, really unique design. So.
Absolutely. Well, you know, with that, I think we've done a good job kind of talking about you know, the things that we like about the game, the features of the game. We've discussed a little bit of, you know, some of the things that people have pointed out as maybe things that they don't like so much. And you know, we've definitely had a good time discussing our history with the game. So, you know, I want to say thanks to you, Luke, for agreeing to come on and for coming on early. We got our time zones mixed up here. So for coming on early and doing the show. It's about 11 o'clock here, but it's only about 9 o'clock your time. So be sure to thank your wife for helping out with the kids tonight so that we could sit and discuss the great Martin Wallace game of Automobile.
It was fantastic. Thank you for the conversation, Jeff.
No problem. My pleasure. And if you have any thoughts or ideas that you'd like to share about the game of Automobile, please feel free to post them in the Longview Guild once this episode posts. Joe is still the one who's doing the posting for me, so he is away on vacation. So he said towards the end of this month is when he thought this episode would drop. So when you see it pop up in your feed, we hope you enjoy the show. Thanks to everybody out there for listening. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to post them. And Luke and I will peruse the forums and see if anybody's got anything they want to say about the episode or questions that they have or points they'd like to bring up about the game. We can have a great discussion online there as well. So for Luke and myself, I want to say thanks to everybody out there for listening and have a great night. And